Okay, welcome back. We just finished talking about the rules for doing comments. Now on page 185, we're going to start talking about variables. Okay, so what the heck is a variable? Well, a variable is basically just a chunk of memory where you store stuff, but instead of calling it by its memory address, right? 47,782,000,000, its physical address. I say first name. I give it a name. So it's all it is. A variable is just a name for a particular spot in memory where you're storing stuff. That's it. It's nothing really complex. Okay. So there's a naming convention that we use for variables. So there's a thing called camel case. Camel case is like this, where I actually have like two words in here, right? There's two words. Like save instant state. There's three words here, and then set content view. So there's three words there, and I guess you could call this words. And so the camel means there's a hump in the middle, which means the thing starts with a lowercase letter, and then if there are, right? Camel case doesn't require you to have two parts, but if you had two or three parts, when you stick them together, the other words get the capital letter. So here it starts with a lowercase and then a capital I and a capital S. Cool. So that's one of those. Pascal case is similar, except it starts with a capital letter. So let's look at those examples. Main activity, edit text. What are those things? Ooh, they're classes. So class names start with a capital letter. So Pascal case. This is called Hungarian Notation. Okay, very old. Back in the VB6 days, Visual Basic 6, they use this notation a lot. A lot of people have gotten away from it big time, and I only use it for doing controls. And then I'm going to go here and create me a constant. So constants use the word final. They don't actually use the word constant, even though I call them constants. So I'm just going to say, public final, I don't know what, int kumquat equals 12. Okay. So this is called full caps. So what have you learned? You've learned camel, Pascal, Hungarian, and full caps. Okay. Are you ready for some rules? Do you grab your paper and pencil? Good. Here are the rules. So, when naming variables, the first character must be a letter or an underscore. Can't start with a number. After the first character, which could be a letter or an underscore, then you can use letters, numbers, and underscores. But they can't start. So I can't have commas or parentheses. Just letters, numbers, and underscore. That's it. That's all there is. And the first letter can't be a number. Okay. Variables are case sensitive, so a capital age is not the same as a lowercase age. Cool. Variable names cannot have spaces, which is why we invented the goofy Pascal and camel case to begin with, is because I didn't want to have first space name, because I can't have a variable with a name in it. So when you cram them together, it all comes out kind of funky. So you put the little capital letter in there. The name should be descriptive. Don't just have temp or X. If you're going to store somebody's age in a variable, why not call it age? Gee, what a concept. Don't call it X or I or, make it describe what it is it's holding. Kind of sort of makes sense. So in this case, maybe this was a bad choice. I'm going to change this to something. I'm going to follow my own advice, doggone it. I'm going to say num students or something. Okay? So now the variable actually means something. You look at it and go, oh, okay. Apparently the number of students is 12. Okay. And then, of course, use camel case. So those are the 6 of the rules. Okay? Cool. On page 186, they talk about the data type. Every one of these variables has to have a data type. I use int here, which means integer. But let's take a look at what the data types are. So first of all, there's a thing called a primitive data type. I'm going to skip that for right now and get back to it. And talk about just those guys. So here they are. This is it. You got Boolean, byte, char, which is short for character, short int, which is short for integer, long, float, and double. And here's how they're kind of related. All right, so a data type there's two different data types. A primitive one, that's the only one we're talking about right this second. And then Boolean, and then we have numeric, and then we have character, and then we have those things that are whole numbers. So whole numbers are bytes, short, int, and long, and floating point numbers are floats and doubles. Okay, kind of makes sense? Okay, one more time. So, integer, for storing whole numbers, what I call counting numbers. You know, like I'm trying to count how many rows there are in a table. Well, I don't need floating point to do that. It's never going to be 4.2 rows. It's always just going to be, 4 or 5, right? A long. So a long basically is just a bigger one. For example, maybe this int is only 4 bytes big. And so maybe you're counting really, really, really big things. So a long is twice that size. Okay? So I typically don't use long. I mean, for counting things. I mean, yes, if maybe I had a database that had, lots and lots of rows, I might have to use long for that. But if I'm just counting like the number of loops or something, I'm not using a long. A float is a floating, decimal number like 4.2. If you wanted to be more precise, you could use the bigger one, which is called double. Now, I typically don't use float. It's just a personal preference. I typically use integer and double. That's it. I rarely ever have to go, well, everyone uses Boolean. Let me start over. Boolean, which is just yes or no. Integer, which is counting. And then floating points for, averages and, things like pay where you're getting paid $8.45. I need to be able to get the 0.45. Can't store that in an integer. Okay. And then a single character, a char, that doesn't come up very often, to tell you the honest to God truth. So I don't use those. I use, int, double, and Boolean. And then there's reference types. Okay. So a reference type is things like a string or an array or whatever. Now those things are classes. Okay, one more time. So a reference type is, for example, I'm going to create me one. Whoops, got the wrong one showing up here. Okay, so I'm going to create me a variable for a type string here. Okay, let me give it a little bit of ring. So string. Ooh, how come the data type is in uppercase? Because it's a class. It's not a primitive. If it was a primitive, I would do lowercase I integer, lowercase b Boolean, lowercase d double. But this is not. This is a reference class, a reference type. So I'm going to say string first name. And then I'm going to go ahead and give it, some sort of a beginning value. Okay, so what's the difference between int age is equal to 12 and string Bob? Well, this one is a primitive and this one is not a primitive, and you can tell because it's a class and it starts with a capital letter. Now, just because the data type starts with a capital letter doesn't have anything to do with my variable name. My variable name still follows the same rules. Lowercase a, lowercase f with a capital N. Okay, variable naming rules don't change. It's just that the data types do. An array and an array list. We are going to cover that in a couple of chapters from now. But you probably sort of halfway remember that. For example, if I had an array of integers, I don't know what these are. We're going to talk about scores is equal to new int. And then I'm going to put, I don't know. Ooh, I know what I'm doing. I'm going to use dumb students. Okay, so by looking at this, you can kind of sort of tell. First of all, I'm using lowercase I, so this is a primitive data type. And yet I'm using a new operator, which means it is not a primitive data type. So how do you resolve that in your head? Okay, here's how it's done. An array is always a reference type, but what it stores could be a primitive type or a reference type. Okay, so what it stores. In this case, it's storing integers, which is primitive. Okay, so it's a little confusing, but bear with me. Okay, so classes are reference types and arrays are reference types, if you remember how this works. Cool. And then obviously if you roll your own class, like later on we're going to build a student class or something, or an employee class or something, then those guys are clearly reference types. Okay, so far let's do a quick review of what all variables have. And we're going to add to this list a little later on. So all variables have a name. That makes sense. And all variables have a data type. Okay, there actually is a third one, but we'll add it a little bit later on. Okay, on page 190, they start talking about using a variable. So if the way, so I created me a variable here. If I go down to here and I want to print out what my age is, I would say et display append, and I'm going to say my age is, and then I'm going to use a little plus sign and type age. Okay, that kind of makes sense. What the heck? Let's go ahead and run this. Oh, wait a minute. Pardon me, just a minute. Let me go ahead and do this, because we have a multi-line guy. Okay, I'm just going to run this guy and see what it does. And it says, my age is 12. Okay, that kind of sort of makes sense. Everything is pretty straightforward. Now, how did that variable happen? I mean, I could have just done this. Okay? Where I did not assign it a value. All right? So what's it going to show you there? If I did not assign it a variable, a value, I can't talk. It's going to say, oh, well, it's 0. You're thinking, wait a minute. I didn't tell that it was 0. Well, you're absolutely right. Because they have, most variables have a beginning value, a default value. Okay. So, so in this case, for the integral types are 0. If you go back to that web page, it actually told you what they were. Here's what the default values for all those things are. For about, so basically all the numeric ones are zeros. That kind of makes sense. Okay. Okay. Now, what happens if I go down to here and I just say, start over again, int age is equal to 12? What's that going to do? Well, I've already declared the variable age here. And then I created another one with the exact same name. That is not good. Not good at all. Typically, in the life of an application, you declare the variable only one time. So since I've declared it here, I am not going to declare it a second time. I'm going to just assign it. Okay, now you can assign it as many times as you like, but it's being declared here on line 16, and that's it. I'm never going to declare it a second time. And then on line 29, I can change the value. Well, actually, I don't actually have a change value. I will now. Okay, so it starts out at being 42, and then it ends up being 12. Okay, we're coming up on the 15-minute mark. You guys know how this works.